Okay, welcome. Let's get started. So are there any more submissions for the homework that's coming in? Got a big stack here. Your graded homework assignment 11 is available here, and here's homework 13, the paper for it, also provided as a PDF on MU Online. If you look at the course schedule that I handed out earlier in the semester, you'll see that homework 13 is due on Friday, so things are going to get pretty busy here until Thanksgiving, and then we'll be able to relax a little bit because we've got this homework assignment due on Friday. The good news is that these are really easy problems, and maybe I've said that before, but this time I definitely mean it. All right? These are easy problems. So get them done quick, and then you can focus your attention on the quiz and the project because both of those are coming up soon as well. And then after Thanksgiving, we'll just have no quizzes left, but we'll have a couple more leisurely submissions for the homework assignments, and we'll roll towards the final exam. So any questions related to the scheduling aspects of things? All right. So take a look at this old-timey car. Has anybody been to the Classic Car Museum that's over in West Huntington? Nobody? I've been there. I see a few people nodding their heads. There's a really nice museum where they've got a remarkable collection of old cars. It's probably several $1 million worth of collectible cars. And if you think about how the production of cars has changed from the 1950s until today, what do you suppose are some of the big innovations that have happened from then until now in manufacturing and differences in the way that cars are made and what they're made of? Automation. And so what effect would automation have on how expensive it is to buy a car? It would lower the price, absolutely. If you've got machines that make it possible for fewer laborers to work, they wouldn't make the switch to machines if they were more expensive than people. And so automation is one of the huge differences. Another is if you think about what cars are made of. Back then, and this is obviously a land whale here. This boat is just enormous and really, really heavy. They've changed, in order partly to improve fuel economy, they're making vehicles out of much lighter materials than they used to. And I remember that when Saturns first came out, people were kind of shocked by the amount of plastic that Saturns were putting into the cars. Like the door panels had lots of plastic in them. But it made the cars lighter and cheaper and easier to make and easier to fix, whereas back then it was huge sections of sheet metal that were difficult to form and shape and difficult to repair if there was an accident. And so if there's one trend with cars from then till now is they're easier to make and less expensive in terms of the material investments, and yet prices then were so much cheaper than they are now. If we look at some of these prices from around then. This is a list of used cars, but the most expensive car on this list was $1,400. Now you could still get a car for $1,400 these days, but you'd be taking a gamble for sure. It wouldn't be anything that you'd want to maybe drive cross country in. And so this is one illustration of how, in spite of the fact that manufacturing has improved and in spite of the fact that they've switched over to cheaper materials and there's a big emphasis on manufacturing efficiency, where Toyota, for example, wants to reduce the number of warehouses they have. And so they arrange for materials to be delivered to them just in time. Like they don't want to have big storage rooms. They just want the parts to come to them from the suppliers the day that they're going to be installed in cars. That's part of the reason why they were in so much trouble after the Fukushima happened a few years ago. You remember there was a tsunami and an earthquake and a nuclear reactor kind of fell apart, and Toyota was in bad shape because they didn't have a lot of stock available in their factories, and so any sort of disruption to the system that they'd set up caused a chain reaction down the line. So all of those things should be making things cheaper to purchase a car, but because of the increase in money supply, that means that money is worth less here in the future, now where we are, compared to back then, where prices were much lower in terms of the number of dollars required to purchase a vehicle. So let's think about inflation and consider how it's behaved over time. The modern era, after World War II, you'll notice that we don't see so much of these negative blue periods. Inflation is when costs are increasing over time, meaning that the value of money is becoming progressively lower. These blue sections are periods of deflation, which means it's a flip of the relationship we normally expect. Periods of deflation are associated with, instead of increasing prices, they're decreasing prices. And instead of money becoming less valuable, during deflation that means money's becoming more valuable over time. We'll talk a little bit more about deflation at the end of the lecture today, but one thing to note is that the wide spikes that used to occur are much more attenuated than they used to be. Although there was a period of pretty serious inflation at the end of the 70s, it didn't go over 15%. It got close, but not over 15. Whereas before that, inflation would routinely go above 20. So a lot of sources have account for the more steady inflation that we face today. Central bank has been given more authority to control the money supply, and being taken away from the gold standard gave them more flexibility to print money when they felt like there was stimulus that needed to occur. But for whatever reason, if you were needing to know roughly what would be a range of inflation to expect for the future, and we don't know for sure, but we could say since the 80s, inflation has been about the 0 to 5% range. And so you could put a line through that middle and be, I don't know, making a pretty good guess on where inflation might be in the future. Here is another way of looking at money supply and the availability of dollars, and this is with wage growth. And what we see from this figure is that in these recent times, that during periods of recession, wages fall, and then during periods of recovery, the wages go up. And I guess there's two ways of looking at that. It's partly that during a recession, companies are not making as much money as they used to. Profits are lower, and so they can pass along less of those wage increases to their employees. But another way of looking at it, and think about the more recent economic contraction that we had in the United States, there was a huge pool of available workers. A lot of people looking for jobs after the crisis that occurred in 2008. And so if there's a lot of people chasing a fewer number of jobs, then the companies don't have to pay as much, or at least they don't have to increase wages as much as they maybe did in the past if people are interchangeable and you can just get someone else for a lower wage. So this wage growth is partly responsible for increases in prices. Remember, it's a relationship between how much money is in the economy and how many goods are in the economy. And last time in class, we were talking about the relationship between prices and demand. So this factors into those ideas as well. So let's look at some terminology. Inflation is the increase in the amount of money needed to get the same amount of goods or services. And an increasing fraction of the U.S. economy is the service sector. It used to be that the United States would make things, manufacture its own cars, toys, clothing. But globalization has moved a lot of manufacturing out of the United States and to places where wages are lower. And so more of the economy in the United States is based on services like the healthcare sector, professional services like accounting, the creation of intangible products like software, and the information economy. Now, F is the variable we're going to use to describe the inflation rate. And that is the rate that prices are changing over time. Now, here's a really important factor, this sub-point here, and that is if your savings account is only paying you the inflation rate, then you don't actually gain any purchasing power. And this phrase, purchasing power, is a really important one, and it can be used to describe a lot of trends. We'll look at purchasing power in just a moment, but think of it this way. When you put money into the bank, one of the advantages of doing that is you're not going to lose it. It's not going to get robbed. If it does, the banks have insurance for that. So it's a place of safety, for one thing. But what you really hope for is for your investments to be an instrument of growth, so that you end up on the other side of making that investment with more money than when you put it in. That can only occur if the rate that you're earning is larger than the inflation rate. And nowadays, that's actually not the case. Most savings accounts are paying less than the inflation rate. You'll remember Everbank, which we talked about before, that money market account that they were bragging being the highest in the nation, paying 1.1%. Well, at basically no time in the modern era have there been any periods where inflation was less than that 1%, maybe for just a couple of months after the financial crisis in 2008. But beyond that, inflation has always been above that 1.1%. And so what it means is that if you put your money in the bank, you're actually, in effect, losing purchasing power. You can't buy as much stuff if the inflation rate is increasing faster than the market rate that you're earning on the investment. So here's something new, the real interest rate. The real interest rate represents whether or not you're gaining purchasing power after you've subtracted out the effects of inflation. So let's say that we were living in an environment where inflation was 3%. If your bank is paying you 3%, then your real interest rate is 0, because all of the interest that they're paying you is only just covering the inflation that's occurring. But your real interest, meaning your ability to buy more in the future than you can buy today, is nil, unless you're having an increase in purchasing power. So if we remove out the effect of inflation, that's what we're going to call the real interest rate. And so banks don't quote this. If you go to Chase Bank or Huntington Bank, they're never going to tell you what is the real interest rate, because that would force them to admit that actually you're losing money by putting it into their institution. What they'll quote is the market interest rate, which doesn't yet account for the effects of inflation. Okay, so market interest rate, or sometimes it's called the inflation-adjusted interest rate, we're going to assign that the variable I sub f to mean that it is the interest rate that sort of is affected by inflation. If inflation goes up, then generally speaking, banks will increase their market interest rate. So the interest rate I sub f is how much you should earn if you have an inflation environment of f, which is the rate in terms of the inflation, and we want to have an increase in purchasing power of I. So here's a formula that relates our present value of something. It could be costs or the value of something we're trying to sell. And what this shows is that there are two factors that account for the relationship between the present and the future. One is the inflation, and then I would be our real interest rate, which is related to an increase in purchasing power. And so if we multiply these two denominator terms together, we're going to have 1 plus I plus F plus I times F. Now the I is the real interest rate, the F is the inflation rate, and what you'll see through the calculations we do for today's in-class exercise is that when you multiply I times F, what you're essentially doing is you're finding out the effect of inflation on the increase in purchasing power. You have to make a little bit more on your market-adjusted inflation rate to cover both. So the first term, 1 plus F, remember F is our inflation rate, so this accounts for the effect of inflation. 1 plus I accounts for any real increase in purchasing power that we may have. And so the market-adjusted interest rate, which is what banks will quote, banks talk in terms of I sub F. It is the inflation rate F plus the effect of any increase in purchasing power. And what I've told you now is that these days we're in a situation where actually you're having a decline in purchasing power because the inflation rate is larger than I sub f, the inflation adjusted interest rate. So this may seem kind of abstract, but hopefully through a few calculations it will be less abstract and maybe a little bit easier to understand. So let's take, for example, a basket of goods that you could buy at the market. It's got some produce. Who knows what this is, hot sauce or juice or something, some bread. Okay, so you go to the store and today can purchase this basket of items for $25. What I'd like you to calculate is what would the price of this same basket of goods be for 3% inflation in 15 years. Now this is just simple compounding. Where we've done compounding in the past, we've said future is present and then 1 plus some interest rate to the n power. And here, instead of using the variable I for interest, we're just going to use the variable f because it's a percentage for inflation. So find the future value of this when we have our present value is $25 and an inflation rate of 3%. How much should we expect to pay for the same basket of goods in 15 years? All right, so when I did the calculations, I got that our price in 15 years would be $38.95. Anybody get that same value? Yeah? Okay. So that's just talking about the price in 15 years. We haven't yet thought about, if we invested the money now, how much would we have to invest in order to buy that basket of goods? And so let's consider that case. If we have a situation where the account we're going to be putting our money into pays 7%, and we're in an environment with inflation of 3%, we want to know how many dollars would be available if let's say instead of buying the basket of goods, you take that same $25 and you put it in the bank where the bank is paying 7%. So how much food, how many baskets of food could you purchase in 15 years if the market interest rate is 7%? So what we're calculating here is we're going to find out how many dollars we'll have in 15 years. So it's the same starting point. We still have the future is present 1 plus some interest rate. Now here what we're talking about, a market interest rate, that is I sub f. So we're trying to find out how many dollars we're going to have at the end of 15 years if you put 25 in the bank today. So if we put that money into the bank $25 in 15 years is going to accumulate up into $68.98. $68.98. That will be our account balance. So how much does the food cost? Well, from the first part of the problem, we got that the price of the food would be $38.95. So how many baskets can we buy? It will just be the ratio of that. We have $68 available, and it's $38 to buy the items, and so we can just do a fraction here. If we've got $68.98 available, and we're paying $38.95 per basket, then that means we can buy 1.771 baskets. So in this illustration, we had an increase in purchasing power. So what I hope you to take away from this is even though there was inflation, because the market interest rate was greater than inflation, we had some positive increase in purchasing power. We can buy more in 15 years than we could buy today with that same $25 because the bank market interest rate was 7%. Everybody feel good about that? All right. So here is the in-class exercise that we're going to start off with. In part 1, we have an item that costs $5,000 and the expected inflation for the item is 4% per year. So we're going to go through the stages of finding out what's the expected cost, and then we want to know what inflation-adjusted interest rate should we earn. So inflation-adjusted interest rate, remember, that is the market interest rate that's actually paid by the bank. So we're solving for I sub f. Were there any extra papers over here on this side? All right. Let's take a look at this one. The first part's pretty easy because when it's asking about the cost, remember the thing that determines cost is simply the inflation rate. The cost isn't determined by what my bank is paying for interest. It's only depending on the inflation rate F. So I can find out if it costs $5,000 today, that in the future it should be $6,083. Now, in part B, it's saying, let's say, for example, that we want to have a real interest rate of 10%. So the real interest rate is fixing I, the variable I. And that's really, I guess, a matter of ambition, saying I want to have 10% real interest rate. I want my purchasing power to increase by 10% each year. There isn't really a website where you can go and rank investment opportunities by real interest rates, but as a matter of illustration, we'll say 10% for that and 4% for the inflation. So it means we have to make 14.4% in order to cover both inflation and our expectations for increase in purchasing power. So if we want to take that, let's say we have that investment that we can earn 14.4% in. If we are going to be earning that, then how much should we submit today into the investment in order to buy the item in 5 years? Well, what we already know is that the future amount in 5 years is going to be this $6,083. And then I'm using 1 plus I to the f in the denominator there because remember that it's interchangeable for this expression that was shown on this slide. So here, 1 plus I plus f plus I times f. Well, those three things are I sub f when you combine those three things together. And so that's what makes the denominator 1.44 to the 5th power because we're compounding over 5 years. And then that tells me that if I invest $3,104 today, then I'll be able to purchase the item in the future at whatever price it's going to be. Any questions about this one? All right, well, let's consider this next problem. If today a Airbus 380 costs $340 million and we expect price inflation F is 9% per year, then what we want to find in this one is how many years is it going to take until the cost is $500 million. And it won't be exactly an exact number of years. It'll be some decimal fraction of the years. But a hint on this one that I give you on the handout is that you can use the log function for this. Now, here's the relationship between future prices and the present cost. F equals P times 1 plus F to the n power. So we know the present cost is $340 million. We know the future cost we're interested in is $500 million, and the inflation rate that we're expecting is 9% per year. So what we're solving for in this problem is n. And since it's in the exponent like that, one of the tools you can use to solve this problem is the definition of a log. So remember, when we've got an exponent of something, we can take the log of both sides, and then that'll bring the exponent out. Or you can put it into your calculator and solve for the variable n. Okay, so we know inflation rate is 9%. We know the present cost, the future amount, and we're just trying to solve for n. And when we do that, it's 4.475 years that the price will get up to that. The irony is that since I created this example, Airbus has announced that they may even shut down production of the Airbus 380, so you can probably get them at a discount these days. They're not doing as well as they had hoped. Although I don't think any of us would be able to afford one, you know, even at the discount. It's still a lot of money for an airplane. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is deflation. Now, here's a website that puts out ad scans for Black Friday before they're officially published. You know, like there's a spy somewhere in the marketing department of Dell, and he emailed out the promotions. You know, this is the sort of thing that they'll start advertising on Thanksgiving so that the Black Friday sale starts the next day. And the thing that caught my attention was this $99 laptop. I'm in the market for a laptop right now, and it doesn't have to be a particularly good one. You know, I don't really need a fast processor or a lot of RAM for the program that I'm going to be using. And so I'm thinking, $99 for a laptop, that's pretty good. And so if you have an expectation that prices are going to go down, what does that do to the demand for products today? What is it? Think about it. If you know that prices are going to be cheaper in 2 weeks, would you buy something today? No, you wait the 2 weeks, right? And so it can lead to kind of a vicious cycle. Like if there's a general expectation in the economy that prices are going down, then what it causes people to do is delay purchases. And then companies who have all this excess inventory, they only have one tool available to stimulate demand. Do you remember from our discussion last time in class? what can retailers do to stimulate demand? Lower prices. They can't force you into the store. All they can do is lower prices, and so they have to lower prices even more. And then people see that happening and they say, wow, not only is it going to get priced cheaper in 2 weeks, but it keeps getting more and more cheaper than I was expecting. And so it's kind of like a spiral of lower prices lead to lower demand because people are seeing a pattern emerge over time. And so it's kind of considered kind of a dangerous thing. If you consider what computers can do, like an old computer is still able to do its same function as it used to, but you don't want to continue employing it because, as we talked about previously, there are other things that are better. And so, sometimes you put off making an upgrade on a computer because you're just going to expect as soon as you buy it, it's going to be out of date. And so there's sometimes a similar urge to the deflationary spiral of delaying an upgrade because some new development's going to come out. Whether it's a newer processor, a better video card, a new style of RAM, whatever it is, there's always this sort of inkling in the back of your mind that whatever you buy is going to be outdated, so why not wait to the next cycle? Well, think of that being applied to all purchasing decisions. And the spiral, the deflationary spiral, starts off oftentimes with a reduction in the economy. Maybe there's an economic crisis that's brought about by a bubble, meaning an artificially high increase in prices. Oftentimes it's a housing bubble where housing prices are going up, so people feel rich and they take out more loans than they ought to, and then because there isn't the underlying demand for the homes, then the prices will crash, and then that will lead to a reduction in the economy. Like the people who are building houses and refurbishing them get laid off. People who are refinancing mortgages are getting laid off, and so the layoffs and wage reductions means that people are not spending as much, and so a reduction in demand means that the manufacturers and the retailers have only one way to boost the demand again. That's with the prices being reduced. And when they reduce their prices, then they're not earning as much revenue as they were expecting. And so there are some companies that can't weather the storm. They have to default on their debts, maybe go bankrupt if they can't restructure their debts, and then that leads to more layoffs. More layoffs leads to a further reduction in demand, and so on. And so deflation is something that central banks are really cautious and really careful to try and avoid. They would much rather have inflation be in the 1 to 2% range than the 0 to 1% range, because 0 to 1% inflation is too close to deflation, and that they have to avoid at all costs. And so it's kind of an interesting special case that ties into the ideas of demand and prices that we discussed last time in class. Okay, when we get together on Wednesday, we're going to continue talking about inflation, but for now, the things that you should be reminding yourself about is that we have a assignment. If you didn't pick up today's homework assignment, that's due in class on Friday. And then we've got a quiz next week following that. So that's it for today. I'll see you on Wednesday.